I'd like to welcome all of you to this very special pre-screening of Phillip Rodriguez's film, Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle, which is presented by USC Visions and Voices and City Projects, is organized by the USC Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism, and is co-sponsored by the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. My name is Yvette Cabrera. I am president of CCNMA, Latino Journalists of California, and I'm very honored to be here tonight, especially because of the history of CCNMA, which was created by a group of Los Angeles journalists who, after the death of Ruben Salazar, saw a void and worked to try to provide opportunities so that other young journalists coming up the pipeline could make a difference as he did. So thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of tonight's events. We're going to, of course, have the screening of the film, Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle. We're going to follow that with a panel discussion and question and answer session. And our panelists for this evening include Thomas Saenz, who's the president and general counsel for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, George Sanchez, who is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at USC, and also serves as the Vice Dean for Diversity and Strategic Initiatives. And lastly, of course, but not least, Phillip Rodriguez, filmmaker and a visiting fellow at the Annenberg School of Communication. We will end the evening with the reception and hope that all of you guys will join us. It will be on the first floor lobby. And now I would like to introduce someone who I've known for many, many years, and who's a pioneer himself, Frank Cruz, who is a USC Board of Trustee. He is a founder of Telemundo, one of the founders of Telemundo, and also KVEA TV here in Los Angeles. He was the first Latino chairman for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and is also one of the primary funders of this film. So please welcome Frank Cruz to the stage.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for that very kind introduction. Delighted to be here for this event. It really is an honor and a privilege. As you well know, this is part of the Visions and Voices program that they have here at the university. The program continues to have a tremendous success here at USC, as well as an opportunity. What it really is an opportunity for our students here at USC to, regardless of their majors, to experience art and the humanities. So I welcome all of you. Ruben Salazar is one of those towering historical figures who not only impacted society while he was working as a working journalist, but also impacted society after his tragic death on August the 29th, 1970. Believe it or not, that was 43 years ago. It's hard to believe. Here we are in 2013 and still recognizing the enormity of the impact that Ruben Salazar has had. After his death, of course, he became almost a martyr in the eyes of many. With the passage of time, for those of you that are old enough to remember or young enough not to know, there are schools, there are parks, there are streets, there are buildings, there are awards, there are scholarships, and even a commemorative stamp named after Ruben Salazar. So he was great as a working journalist for the Los Angeles Times for many years, but after his tragic death. I was teaching history at Cal State University, Long Beach in the late 1960s. I was teaching Chicano studies courses, history classes at Long Beach State. That was when Ruben was writing for the Los Angeles Times. The 1960s, if you recall, were really some very turbulent years. There was an enormous amount of social activism, a lot of anti-war activism, resulting, as some of you may recall, in the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, And in addition to that, to put this period in context, in the midst of all of this turmoil, there were the assassinations of President Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. So as you see this documentary this evening, keep in mind the period of time that Ruben and many of us were living through at the time. Ruben covered many of these events for the Los Angeles Times, but probably he is best remembered, no question about it, as the first real Chicano reporter who really reported in depth the issues, the problems, and the concerns that affected the Chicano community for a mainstream media newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. There had been other articles and there had been some research and scholarly efforts, but in terms of someone writing about them on a daily basis as a columnist and as a reporter, he was really the first. He was truly a professional journalist in all aspects of it. He worked for many years in El Paso. He worked for many years up in the San Francisco Bay Area for the Santa Rosa newspaper. He worked in Latin America, covered the Vietnam War, ran the Mexico City Bureau for the LA Times. So when he arrived in Los Angeles to work for the Los Angeles Times here in LA, you can see the context of what he was bringing to the table in terms of his background, as well as what was occurring in a social historical context at the time. Very, very active period. August 29th, 1970 was billed as the Chicano Moratorium March. It was a march against the Vietnam War, in which Latino soldiers were dying in proportionately greater numbers than any other ethnic group in the country at the time. There was an enormous amount of concern at the time. I still vividly remember marching. It began on 3rd, then we went down Atlantic. In Atlantic, we turned right onto Whittier Boulevard with the intent to ultimately end that march at then Laguna Park. I always knew it as Laguna Park because it was about a block away from where I lived on Gage and Whittier at the time. It is now, of course, Salazar Park. I remember vividly marching with a lot of students of mine who were students at Long Beach State University with me. There was a great turnout by the campus. It was a massive march in terms of numbers, over 30,000. It not only were individuals from the Los Angeles area and the colleges and the universities involved, but people from across the country came to be part of that particular march. And the rally was to take place at the end of the march. Remember, it began on 3rd, for those of you familiar with East LA, 3rd down to Atlantic, Atlantic to Whittier, Whittier down under the Long Beach Freeway, past El Calvario Cemetery, and then to Laguna Park. During the course of the march, and it was hot, it was a smoggy Saturday in Los Angeles, there were reports of some looting that had been going on at a liquor store nearby. It quickly escalated. The sheriffs gave the order to clear the park, and needless to say, to use a trite phrase, all hell broke loose then. In the final analysis, it was probably the bloodiest, pardon me? Okay. The rioting resulted, of course, in the death of 3 individuals, Ruben Salazar included. And as Yvette mentioned, after his death, a couple of years after, in '72, I and a handful of other Chicano journalists started the California Chicano News Media Association that created a scholarship in his honor. The documentary you're about to see, Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle, is truly the first independent and thorough investigation that I know of on Salazar's life and death. There have been a lot of articles, a lot of newspaper reports over the years, but I think this, you're going to see probably the true first in-depth look at his life and death. One of the things that you should look to see, Phillip and his crew have gotten an interview with the gentleman who fired the canister. Many people thought he had passed away, but apparently they were able to find him somewhere in the Midwest. But look for that. The producer is Phillip Rodriguez. Phillip is an Annenberg Fellow who creates and produces films and educational programs. He produced Race 2012, Latinos 08, which appeared on PBS. The documentary came to fruition in great part due to the support of the Trojan family, including faculty, staff, and student interns. And with that, I'd like to extend some thank yous to the following people and organizations very quickly. I don't know if Dr. Gutierrez is here, but Felix Gutierrez played a role. His 12 students, USC Professor Robert Hernandez, produced the Ruben Salazar Project Digital Timeline. Phil Montes, from the Trojan class of 57 and 58. The USC Libraries, the Bachman Center for Iberian and Latin American Studies, the Special Collections Unit, which housed the Ruben Salazar papers. Hugh Hefner Moving Image Archive from the USC Cinema School, and of course the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. We would also like to acknowledge some of the interviewees who you're going to see in the series, in the documentary, who are with us this evening. Jimmy Flores, Bob Gibson, Ricardo Lopez, Ernesto Vigil, Steve Weingarten. The film, Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle, couldn't have been made without the assistance of our funders, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, Latino Public Broadcasting, Cal Humanities, the California Community Foundation, and Southwest Airlines. And most importantly, we would like to thank the Salazar family. Two of his daughters, I think, or both of you, or just one is here tonight, Lisa and Stephanie. So thank you for joining us this evening. So without any further ado, I think we're ready to roll back in the back. Let us watch Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle.
First of all, let me say congratulations, Phillip. That was riveting. I think it answered a lot of questions. There have been a lot of unanswered questions for so many years, and it's, as a journalist, I appreciate you putting the facts out there. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say I think one of the things about the film that's so great is that it paints a fuller picture. I remember starting out as a journalist reading Border Correspondent, the compilation of Ruben Salazar's columns and articles, and he was definitely an inspiration to me, but I was also guilty of sort of lionizing him. And I remember interviewing Lisa a couple years ago for the 40th anniversary of her father's death, and she reminded me that in the end, you know, he was a father, he was a husband, he was a human being, he had flaws, and I think it's important to get that out there, and so that's why I also appreciate the work in the film. So let me get our panelists up here so we can start our panel discussion. First, I'd like to have Thomas Saenz come up here, who is the President and General Counsel of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We all know him as a nationally recognized civil rights attorney. Most recently, he was working for former Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa as counsel to his office, where he provided legal and policy advice on major initiatives. And before that, for 12 years, he conducted civil rights litigation for MALDEF, successfully challenging Proposition 187 and other important civil rights cases in the areas of immigrant rights, education, employment, and voting rights. So thank you, Thomas, for being here today. Next, I'd like to have Professor George Sanchez come up here. He's the Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Southern California here, where he also serves as Vice Dean for Diversity and Strategic Initiatives. His academic work focuses on historical and contemporary topics of race, gender, ethnicity, labor, and immigration. And he's currently working on a historical study of the ethnic interaction of Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans, and Jews in the Boyle Heights area of East Los Angeles in the 20th century. So welcome, George. And last, I'd like to invite the director, Phillip Rodriguez, to come up here, who is a visiting fellow at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and also a founder of City Projects, an organization that creates documentaries and educational programs for our rapidly diversifying American population. He's directed various documentaries, including one examining the 2008 presidential election through the prism of ethnic politics, and he won a 2009 CNEG Golden Eagle Award for Best News and Analysis for that. He also directed Brown is the New Green, George Lopez and the American Dream, which I haven't seen, but that sounds really fascinating, which won a 2008 Imagen Award for Best TV. And lastly, he was a 2006 United States Artist Broad Fellow Award. He won that, and this is an annual award made by the United States Artists, which honors the country's finest living artists. So congratulations, and thank you for being here.
May I say very quickly that the film is not, I'm just a pretty face of the film, but there's a lot of people in this room that made it, and I want to acknowledge them and buy them a drink later on.
I thought we could start first, George. I wanted to see if you could give us a little bit of history and sort of set up the stage for us for the years leading up to Ruben's death. What was the situation for Mexican Americans here in Los Angeles in terms of political empowerment, in terms of identity, and their relationship with law enforcement?
Sure. I'll do that as quickly as I can. Very clearly, the 1960s was a transformative experience for the Mexican American community, particularly in Los Angeles. But it was in the context of, of a national movement for civil rights and a transformation. I think for Los Angeles and for particular relationships between minority communities and the police department, the 1965 Watts riots is absolutely critical to put on the table. That created a whole different dynamic, and particularly within the police department and the sheriff's department, it created a context in which there was ever-increasing sense that they had to prepare for the next riots. And in fact, that began to occur in lots of different ways. For a lot of young Chicanos, this was a period of looking for new leaders, looking for new directions, taking hold of an urban movement that up to that point had been largely seen as a rural one in terms of the Chicano community. And I think that accelerates basically starting with the 1968 walkouts from East LA schools. Something done from high school students, working with college students and other people in the community. That acceleration all of a sudden refocuses a lot of attention from simply the African American community into the East LA community. And what you get in the next 2 years is an incredible attention to all of the young people's movements on the east side. You get infiltration of a lot of different organizations. You saw that reflected in the film in terms of what was there by the time you reached 1970. And a greater recognition that the issues that were concerning Chicanos in the schools were tied to the Vietnam War, were tied to other sorts of issues that were critical to the whole nation. The moratorium, of course, brought those things together, all together in very critical ways. And it's very clear that while the the police department might not have been quite ready for what occurred. They had been preparing for the possibility of this sort of thing for quite some time, both by infiltration, also by having regular connections and excursions. So there's a kind of buildup to August of 1970 that I think happens throughout the 60s, but clearly from 68 to 70, there's an acceleration of that tension.
Okay. And then following his death, Phillip, I wanted to see if you could address the impact that you saw in terms of, I know you interviewed how many dozens of people for the film. Can you talk about, because clearly what you titled the film Man in the Middle, can you talk a little bit about his death and the impact that his death had on the Mexican American community as far as making him a martyr, but also who was he and what did we learn from
You know, I'm not sure I'm really qualified to answer that question as well as maybe George would be. Certainly, as the film suggests, Salazar was raised to martyr level among certain groups, and so depending on what's interesting about how the interviews we conducted, people had very different ideas about the outcome, whether he was killed intentionally or not, depending upon their ethnicity. White folks and his friends in the newsroom said, well, it was an accident, clearly. There was no equivocation. We did a great job investigating this. The Times was thorough, and it was a goddamn shame. He was my friend, and I miss him, but it was an accident. Whereas Chicanos, by and large, held to the belief that it was intentional, and that Ruben was killed as a result of a conspiracy. And that was a curious a space to walk into, and of course, and attempt to sort out while being fair. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Best I can do.
George, did you want to add to that? Because I'm interested in looking at sort of the impact after his death. Did it galvanize the community? I know there was a lot of misinformation out there as well because the information wasn't being released and there weren't any conclusions with the investigation. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on the community, politically and otherwise?
Sure. I mean, I think there was, you saw in terms of the coroner's inquest what was sort of a circus and a lot of sense that something was being hidden. And I think without that being answered, that would always stay as part of the growing sense that somebody is not telling the truth here. Right. And I think that just goes over decades. To me, what was fascinating about the film has to do, and I'll just sort of raise this, it's sort of, you see a real man, you see someone who, in my mind, was a professional struggling with that middle position and really struggling with how he was going to enact that. I would say it's one of the best descriptions of a professional journalist working at that intersection that I have seen. And to me, I think sometimes the mythology that builds up after his life makes us forget that part of who he was. That for the students who are thinking about being professionals, thinking about entering situations where they still may be the first, where they'd have to negotiate different kinds of contexts. This is an incredibly powerful story about being very early in that process, the one person who was there in the newsroom having to sort of figure out what is my position. And you also saw how he was affected by what was going on around him and what was reporting, and particularly in 1970, how his own personal decisions begin to change and move. So I think that part of his own trajectory, his own learning process, we lost a little bit from because we had kind of built a mythology about his death, not paying as much attention to his life.
Right, right. I had no idea he lived in Orange County until I wrote a column about it a couple years ago.
Yeah,
But
there were facts like that which just weren't
Yeah.
convenient for the Chicano mythology, right?
Yeah.
The facts of his life just didn't fit into the framework that was needed to appropriate him for their
Yeah.
purposes, which were legitimate purposes, certainly.
Right.
But the ambition of the film was to present an individual, a man in the middle of the century, was a silent generation man having to confront a new model of identity, and so hopefully we pulled it off.
And I think some of those issues, I mean, still pertain to the new generations. I know at least for me, no matter what ethnicity or race you are, there's an expectation that you should be loyal to your community. And so you go out there to cover stories, and your job is to uncover the truth, but there's an expectation that you should be on someone's side. And so it was very interesting to see him go through that struggle as well. Tom, can you talk a little bit about, so these documents that the Sheriff's Department refused to turn over, MALDEF played a very important role in filing this lawsuit. Tom, can you talk a little bit about why MALDEF took this on and why it was so important?
Sure. Well, first let me publicly congratulate Phillip, because I think it's a terrific film.
Thanks.
Really. But I think the answer to your question lies in part with what George was just saying. I mean, history is a living thing. And the story of Ruben Salazar, the man, is critically important and will have impacts for young people today, young Latinos who are looking to take on a role in telling stories through journalism and otherwise. And it's important that it be the full story. And when documents are being withheld, particularly 40 years on, and there is a public lack of awareness of what's in those documents, it's not the full story. And those young people who will be influenced by the story of Ruben Salazar, I think, deserve to have the full story. The mission of MALDEF for 45 years has been to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States, and the future civil rights of our community as the Latino community continues to grow in its size and its impact, now the largest minority group in the country, 1 in 6 Americans, has to be a part of that living history. That living history has to serve that goal for the future, and making sure that the full story is there is not only critically important for the future, it also answers one of the major issues that our community, I think, has faced throughout its history. Despite momentary and significant disruptions, the pattern for our community has been one of often being overlooked and invisible and not depicted fully in media, still true today, whether that's print media or broadcast media, or even today social media and online media, and really attacking that issue of being overlooked and invisible is about ensuring that the full story, the full history is out there. And given his importance, I think the full story, including the critical depiction of him as a human being, is important. And that full picture of the human being includes knowing the facts that are available, the documentation that's available around the events of August 29th, 1970.
And specifically, so the Sheriff's Department was arguing that these records were not, that they were exempt from public disclosure. What?
Well, I
Can
think the
you talk
Sheriff's
a little bit
Department made a
about-
mistake, and I can't explain why they made that mistake, but they decided to allow Phillip and others to review the documents without taking anything out, without taking copies, without really having an ability to share effectively what he and a few others saw with the general public. And that's simply not legally permissible under our laws. You can't decide, whether you're the sheriff or anybody else, that a certain group of folks are going to have the full story, but then not be able to share that full story with the general public. And that was ultimately the flaw in the legal position of the Sheriff's Department. And in lots of ways, it plays right into what we've been discussing. It's as though the sheriff is going to decide that certain folks need to know the story, whether that helps to the Sheriff's Department to somehow feel absolved or somehow have closure, as they would say, for the department, but then can't share it with the general public so that everybody knows the story of what's there, what survives in terms of documentation. So not only is that legally flawed, I think it really is a perpetuation of some of the patterns that the Latino community has experienced over time.
And you,
Are there any questions from the audience here?
yes. Is anyone lined up? Do you have a question? Do you wanna, there's a microphone right here.
I've been standing here, so.
Oh, you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is the mic on? There you go.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Jaime Cruz. I'm chairman of the National Chicano Moratorium Committee, also former assistant director of the Centro Chicano here on campus. Also a marcha monitor on the August 29, 1970 marcha, along with two other comrades here. Ironically, issues still remain the same. The cover-ups just get deeper. We conducted the 43rd commemoration of the Chicano Moratorium this past August. It's been our responsibility as the National Chicano Moratorium Committee to continue this, because if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. And one thing that keeps coming back to my mind is what happened on that day, and that it's our position that it was more than a conspiracy. It was a definite plan by elements of COINTELPRO, other elements of the FBI, the CIA, LAPD, the sheriffs, and many others who were informants, some of them of which we've exposed, and some which will be exposed. This is the updating of the history from the community perspective. And I just want to point out Ricardo Lopez and the research that he's done for decades on bringing this information needs to be recognized. I certainly want to recognize Ricardo for that. Take a lot of courage to do that. We continue the Chicano movement because it is very key and central to what is going on today. COINTELPRO never
Did you have a
away.
question, sir?
It evolved. And it's my question. COINTELPRO has evolved into Homeland Security. Do you see any future films that go into the COINTEL manipulations and its metamorphosis as to what we know today in surveillance?
What, you're asking me?
Yes.
One of the frustrating aspects of the project was of course, law enforcement in general's reticence about this era. And certainly the Department of Justice has been very reluctant, to say the least, to provide us with a full accounting of their actions in that era. And so I would suspect that when the time comes, when the DOJ decides to let us know what they were up to in that period, there will be a great deal of material for historians and filmmakers to work through. And though I disagree with your assessment of what happened to Ruben Salazar, I do believe that that we do have a right, and we should insist upon our right to know what our government was what kind of activity, legal and otherwise, that they were up to in that period.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a statement, maybe for the younger people. As an older person that happened to be living when Ruben Salazar was on Channel 34 and wrote for the LA Times, I just want to express maybe to the young people how fortunate we were when we were young, because many of you don't have very good discussions with your parents because you read different things. In my case, I had a very rich discussion with my father, who was Mexican and Spanish-speaking, abracero from the 1940s, because I read the LA Times and read his articles, and then my father would catch him on Channel 34. So we had rich discussions about police brutality, about poverty, about the Chicano condition, and it's basically because of Ruben Salazar. It was really, really, I wish it for the future generations where you can have conversations with your parents, because even if they don't read English or speak English, they can listen to somebody, a leader. Channel 34, I think he was KMEX director, and he had a commentary. I believe it's every couple days or whatever he was on there. So my father was very informed, even though he was illiterate. He didn't read English, and anyway, we kept in contact. So I just want to
Thank you very much.
let you know that.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? We have one more.
Yeah. I'm just curious, in respects to the participation, not only August 29th, 1970, but in January 1968 of the moratorium against the war in Vietnam, and then in 1970, which was a national Chicano moratorium against the war in Vietnam, and of course against, the question is, how many people here today were there? I know there were some. In respects to understanding the concept of what's happening, the reason I'm asking, because I was an organizer, a young man of the moratorium committee, okay? And to this day, when my camarada Jaime Cruz spoke in respects to the continuance, how many people did participate, and not only participate, but help organize, that are here today in respects to bringing back that question of racism, prejudice, race, murder of the police enforcement at that time, to this day? How many were
You're
there?
asking the audience?
How many here were there?
Maybe
Okay.
A dozen?
Now, you all understand why I'm raising this question is that this is not just going to be one question about Ruben Salazar. Ruben Salazar brings up a lot of other questions, a lot of other issues that need to be brought in, because in the documentary here, they saw my brothers and sisters wearing the brown berets. I am still a brown beret, National Brown Berets Aslan, Minister of Information. So I'm raising this question, why and how we need to settle this question of the murder and how the Chicano community responds to. 2 brown berets were murdered that day, 17, 18-year-old, Lynn Ward, Angel Diaz, okay? That is not raised in the question of murders and the question of what happened that day in 1970. And yes, Ruben Salazar was a professional. Yes, the family's affected, but what about the families of Angel Diaz, Lynn Ward, and what is happening here? So I raise the question, what is to be done? What is to complete the investigation of not just Ruben Salazar, but the Brown Berets, and which we continue today?
Okay.
I
Thank you,
raise
sir.
that question to you, how to answer that.
Thank you, sir. George, can you address that at all? Have the deaths of the other 2 been written about or covered?
Well, you know, Tom raised, I think, the most critical thing, that we have to fight hard to get every single document open and available to everyone. That's a kind of critical issue. If we're in fact going to have full accounting, full histories, future documentaries about exactly those issues. If the literature, if the documents are not made available, we won't have significant historical work and moving forward on these issues. So for me, that's the first and most important issue, which is to push that every single document is made available, and that anyone can take a look at it, anyone can see. There's going to be, and I think there will continue to be, a variety of interpretations about the events, and there should be lots of voices actually documenting what happened to lots of different people. And I think that's critical. That requires, right, more and more people being trained to do the historical research, to be trained to do the documentaries, an opening up of a whole array of people. You saw the number of people that raised their hands that they were there. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there'll be fewer. That's the reality of one of the things that we're looking at.
Right.
It's just true. I like to say all the time, I was 10 years old at that point. I was 10 years old then. right? And I'm 53 now. So I think about a lot of the students who are here who are 18, 19, 20, 22, right? If we're going to have true histories, those documents have to be there. The memories have to be there. People have to be interviewed. People have to leave their own information, what they remember, what those experiences were like. And a new generation will look back at those things if they are available and write new histories. And that will continue and continue and continue. And to me, that's what history is about. It's those reinterpretations. If the documents are kept secret, if the memories are not written down, if people are not interviewed, we lose the information we need to write new histories.
Thank you, George. I think what struck me too about his writing is that when you look at his columns or his articles, a lot of the issues that he addressed, inequities in the Mexican-American community, the Latino achievement gap, the law enforcement issue, so many of those issues still, it feels like they haven't changed that much. So I think that's another important thing, especially for young journalism students coming up.
They have and they haven't. Go ahead.
Hi, questions for Phillip. I think it's going to be an easier question. Is this the first time that the film has been viewed, and what are the plans for it?
This is the first.
PBS was one of the sponsors. Is it going to be airing on PBS?
This is the first time the film's been seen by people outside the crew, and some people that saw it at different stages, like George. And the film will air nationally on PBS, and that was the ambition of the film. This story of Salazar had been really kind of considered to be a regional and an ethnic story, and I think it's a big American story. And so we're putting it on prime time, and people in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and across the nation will have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what the Mexican-American experience has been. The film will also be show at the Smithsonian in late February. We'll do film festivals. We've planned a educational tour to hit schools and libraries in the coming year. So we have every intention of reaching out rather aggressively to make sure that people of all ages can witness the project.
Do you have a target date for PBS?
We don't have a date yet. It'll be early 2014.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we have another.
All right, are we wrapping up?
Can I ask a quick
How much time
question?
do we have?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, a couple
Yeah.
more questions.
I have a question, and it's more for clarification for the filmmaker and for Professor Sanchez. I wanted to find out, in the scenes where you showed the sheriff actually, the pictures of the sheriff shooting into the silver dollar, I noticed that there was already some rioting activity happening outside. My understanding is that the riots didn't filter out to Whittier Boulevard until a couple of days later. But were there already riots at that time on Whittier Boulevard?
The historical accounting of that event is very, very murky, and we were lucky enough to have people like Jimmy Flores, who was indeed there and found his way ushered into the Silver Dollar Bar at gunpoint by a sheriff. So we interviewed lots of people firsthand, and if you want to know more, this is probably not the venue to discuss it, but perhaps we can do it later. But there's lots of interesting details that are well worth. We tried to distill a rather complicated story of a whole man's life in 1 hour, and of course. There's lots of raw data out there, and if you're interested, certainly the sheriff files of the Salazar homicide are at USC now, and you can work your way through and find your way to a lot of detail. So I suggest
Just
to do that.
We have one last question over here.
Yes, as I think you can hear me. As somebody who was there at that time, and as somebody who's concerned about what the data shows, could you please describe what is in the collection available on this campus in terms of all the data that you went through to produce the 1 hour film that you did? I'm addressing this to Phillip. Would you please specify the type of material that is available on this campus for young historians, activists, researchers, filmmakers?
I would suggest, Ernesto, that you speak with Barbara Robinson here, who's in the second row, and she's a librarian, and she can tell you exactly what you need to know. Barbara, where's this stuff? Where's this collection held?
It's in the Memorial Library.
Doheny Memorial Library? Special collections.
Right. How many boxes, for example, film, interviews?
Como chingues, Ernesto.
We were going to wrap up now, but I also want to highly recommend, if you can't make it out there physically, you can also go to USC's Annenberg website and check out the Ruben Salazar project, which is a great detailed account put together by students of different chapters of his life, and it refers back to documents and evidence as well. So thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it, and congratulations again, Phillip.